to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Waller, an author and journalist who's covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what have we got on today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. And this episode is all about you and your recent trip to Africa as the first stage of your research into your book, In Search of Africa's Lost Railway, which is scheduled for publication next year. Loyal listeners will know that we were hoping to record this content from Africa, but technical challenges were too great. So now you're safely back in Blighty, and we're recording this from your home in London. And of course, you started off by visiting South Africa, didn't you, Christian? What happened there?
Well, yes, we flew to Cape Town. I was accompanied by my mate Liam because it was a long journey to do on my own, and it was much more fun to have somebody with me. And we started off in Cape Town, and we had kind of expected there might be a train to Johannesburg once a week at least. That's been about 1,000 miles kind of across much of South Africa. But no, all the trains, the long distance trains in South Africa have actually stopped running. They stopped running after COVID and for various technical reasons, which we will go into. And so I didn't get my first ride until well after, and we'll cover that in the second half of this podcast. But first of all, I did find out about South African railways and discovered why they hadn't been operating with an interview I did.
Yes, so you spoke to David Williams, who's the author of On the Railway, a study of the history of South Africa's railways. And here's your discussion with David.
I've been in South Africa for the past 10 days, touring up from Cape Town, up through the Cape, up to eventually Pretoria, and now I'm in Johannesburg. And this is in search of what I've called Africa's Lost Railway, which was the project by Rhodes to build a line from the Cape right through to Cairo, essentially through the whole of the African continent, in order, of course, to establish Britain's imperial presence throughout the continent. But I've been very surprised to find that certainly on the southern part of this railway, there are no longer any long-distance trains. There's a few suburban services out of Cape Town, but there are no other trains operating on South Africa's long-distance network. And so I've come to Johannesburg to talk with David Williams, who has just written a book about the history of South African railways. And I wanted to kind of explore why this has happened and there are no trains. So, David, you've been telling me that actually the roots of this problem, which has been put down to COVID by many of the people I've talked to, actually go far deeper than COVID. So maybe tell me a bit about, how this terrible situation has arisen.
So yes, whoever tells you that COVID was the cause of South Africa's rail decline is making things up or ignorant. COVID was the final nail in the coffin of the network. There was a coffin before COVID. And the reason there was that coffin probably goes back half a century to when the old National Party government in the years of apartheid abolished protection for the railways from the roads. Without thinking, how do you keep rail-appropriate traffic on the railways?
What was the form of that protection?
The protection was that road operators had to have permits. So to take goods from one city to another, you had to apply for a permit, and the permit only allowed you to take so much goods over such and such a period of time.
Everything else had to go by rail.
Had to go by rail, And it did. And when they opened it up, incidentally, the permit system had been honoured more in the breach than the observance, because there were so many loopholes and people just started carrying goods in defiance of the system. Eventually they abolished this, and this was in 1977.
So you really established the beginning of the decline of the railway for 50 years.
Yes, mid-70s, mid-1970s. And from then, there was a steady move of traffic, passenger and goods, from rail to road. And unfortunately, the governments then, this is before the ANC, and I'm interested to hear how many people say, oh, the ANC government took over in South Africa and the railways were wrecked because of it. No, it started at least 20 years before that. ANC government didn't help, confused policy, and then in the era of what we call state capture under President Zuma, where the government became a place for looting and corruption, which undermined the railway system further. By the time that COVID came, the system was not on its knees, it was flat on its face.
So can you just elaborate a little bit more about the reasons for the decline? Obviously, there was road competition, but it wasn't just that, because in your superb book on the history of the South African railways, you paint a wonderful picture of, long distance trains with, waiters in white jackets serving people, people basically being tucked into bed, children being given teddy bears, all this kind of thing.
Not quite.
Not quite, maybe, but that sort of thing. And so it takes quite something to decline from that to no services at all, because, just looking at the equivalent in Britain, we still have a, very well-run long-distance rail network, which, has, a train every hour, say, from London to Glasgow, London to Edinburgh.
Yeah, so I think it was maybe the analogy of the frog in the water that's heating up. No big decision was made which changed everything. Right. Slow decline. And I talked to you earlier about the idea of critical mass in a big railway organization, which at its peak in South Africa employed 230,000 people. You were saying to me that British Rail employed 650,000. Well, in terms of our system and the size of our country and population, 230,000 was the biggest employer in the country. And what happened was that traffic went from rail to road, passenger and goods, and it was slow, but it was steady, and suddenly certain parts of the network became uneconomic. They closed certain parts, which then hastened other parts being closed. And what I call the critical mass of management capacity in a big railway system, you go below that level and suddenly you've got things not being done, and connections are not being made, and repairs are not being done. And the people who are still there lose motivation, they lose morale because they're being asked to do too much. Safety is compromised, and that was one of the big problems in South African railways. Safety started being an issue.
But there were accidents, were there?
Accidents, but also on the trains. People weren't safe.
Oh, right, security.
And there were the railway police. There was a large organization, railways police. That's all they did. They looked after trains, they patrolled trains, they patrolled stations. You imagine all these goods yards, trucks with tarpaulins over them, and they're open there for criminals to steal things unless there's a deterrent. And the railways police used to be that deterrent. And they abolished them and moved them into the South African police. So suddenly we have all these goods yards and stations and trains insecure, unsecured.
So you get the ANC government coming in 1994.
Yeah.
And they must have been pretty pro-rail, and they're certainly the rail organisation is a state-governed, state-owned entity. So were they not enthusiastic about kind of boosting rail?
I think they were, but it wasn't a priority. And one of my little theories is that for black South Africans, under apartheid, train travel was not a pleasant experience. You might have needed to take the train for economic reasons, or in those days, talking apartheid years, there were no taxis. Buses were heavily regulated. So if you wanted to move from one big place to another big place, you needed to take the train. But it was third class. You didn't go in the dining car. You didn't go first class. So you have a ruling class of black people coming in under the ANC who have no happy memories of train travel.
Because they weren't allowed.
Weren't allowed.
Right.
Nor were they allowed to work on the railways. So steam engine stokers, firemen and drivers, reserved for whites. Dining car stewards, chefs, all these occupations which should have been open to everyone, restricted to whites until the 1980s.
So they had a lack of culture of...
No railway culture, no happy memories. And I think they, the more sensible people saw the economic advantage of having an efficient train system, railway system. But no emotional pull to it. And the roads had expanded all the time. Rail shrunk. And I think the government's mind was on other things, really.
So maybe it was inevitable that, long distance services probably are not very profitable, that you need a lot of track to be maintained and so on. Maybe, just as in America, where there are effectively no long distance public rail services, apart from Amtrak kind of running one train a day on parts of it and the Northeast Corridor. So maybe that's the fate of South Africa as well, just the geography doesn't work for it, don't you think?
Yes, and as you say, if you have Cape Town to Johannesburg, which is 1,600 kilometers, there's a lot of track to maintain. And that's why it was folly 25 years ago to split the passenger rail from the freight rail. If you have a passenger operation trying to work over 1,000 miles, it's going to cost them a lot of money to pay their part of maintenance.
Right.
Whereas when it was an integrated company, railway system, it was all part of the same thing. So the one rode on the back of the other, depending.
With a bit of cross-subsidy.
Yes, cross-subsidy, but not in an unproductive way. And the split meant that passenger rail had to take second place when it came to locomotives, when it came to scheduling, which in turn meant fewer people wanted to travel because the service wasn't reliable. So it was a disaster. And to restore passenger rail would mean that you'd have to sort out that problem. You'd have to give passenger trains priority, which they always did have in Britain and America and South Africa, because the ultimate for a driver or a conductor or a guard was to be on the passenger train. And what that did was concentrate the mind of the organization to be efficient.
Because that was the elite.
Because you were answering to the public.
Right.
So your elite trains had to answer to the public and be on time. And as airlines came in, 1950s, trains had to compete on punctuality and convenience. And in Europe, this is still the case because it's most of the European capitals, the railway station is in the center of the city.
Yeah.
But you've got to go far out to get the airport.
Yeah.
So it's a competitive advantage. And unless you capitalize on that, you're going to give up your business. And that's what's happened here.
But also you were saying to me earlier that they haven't really sorted out the issue about a social railway. So, in Britain, we're fairly clear that it's a commercial railway, which is on the main lines and on certain kind of profitable routes. And then there's a railway that needs subsidizing, which is on the kind of, branch lines and smaller regional routes and so on. And in South Africa, you don't have that concept?
Well, we did. And the railways were under pressure from the start. 1910, when the South African Railways Company was founded, based on the old Boer republics and the Natal and Cape Government Railways, united South African Railway.
4 railways there.
Into one.
Yeah.
The social obligation, particularly before motor cars and trucked lorries and trucks were common, the obligation of the railways was to carry people from all these far-flung areas and to carry goods and deliver goods and so on. Whether it made them money or not, they were obliged to do it.
Right.
And even though a lot of traffic went to the road, they were obliged until the 1980s to continue providing these services. Now, maybe the advantage now is that these services have gone. So if you want to reinvent the network, you don't pretend that you're going to have uneconomic services to small towns. You say, we're going to have several main lines, maybe a few branch lines, and we will have commuter traffic, and maybe you can redesign it so that it does make economic sense, as opposed to pretending to service every village. I mean, in Britain, one of the great outrage with the beaching cuts was that there were all these little villages which had a railway, and people were outraged that they no longer had a
But
railway.
they were never going to. They were never going to survive.
No, but in our case, beaching in England, they closed the lines while they were still operating. They may have been uneconomic, but they closed them.
Right.
In our case, they're gone.
Right. Right.
So now if we want to start again, which in fact we have to do, now we need to actually, and maybe this is the optimistic side, is you actually design the new railway system for what is needed as opposed to legacy social responsibility.
You don't think that the situation that has pertained since COVID, which is 5 years ago, we've had no long distance rail services, you don't think that can be restored by trying to go back to what it was like before? You think that maybe you need a new organization, say, I don't know, an EasyJet for the railways or something, to take over the running of these services, or to institute the running of these services?
So if you look at the old system, it wasn't a dining car and a full service on every line. There would be a passenger service, maybe one train a day. No services particularly, just sit on the train.
Right.
Often there were goods trains which had a passenger coach
It's
at the
attached to
back.
passenger. Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And they had the guards van, and I think we had particularly special guards vans. So you'd have the guards van on a goods train, 2 compartments for passengers,
Right.
which was a sensible thing to do.
Right.
So a lot of these lines never had a full passenger service.
Right.
So what they need to restore is the South African railway network, showing Johannesburg's importance as an economic centre. It was like a wagon wheel. So the main passenger services went from Johannesburg to Durban, to the north to Petersburg in Zimbabwe, to the Eastern Cape, Port Elizabeth, to the Western Cape, Cape Town, to Namibia, and it was radiating from a single
From Johannesburg.
Pretoria, Johannesburg.
Right.
Pretoria, Johannesburg. And really, if you could restore that, Maputo was the other one, going to the east, Mozambique. If you could restore those 7 or 8 mainline passenger services between Johannesburg, Pretoria, and those coastal cities,
Yeah.
then you would have a realistic proposition. And you wouldn't, in the old days, there weren't many full-fledged services to everywhere else. It's those mainline between the big centres.
Right.
And there was one between between Durban and Cape Town, which went across country, took 2 days, wonderful journey. Otherwise, it was overnight journeys from and to Johannesburg from the coastal cities. That would be a proposition.
Right. Do you think that the private sector has a role to play?
They could, if the private sector is to be involved, they need to see a return either next year or the year after or in 20 years' time. It's a bit like investing in a mine. You're not going to get your money next year. You may get it in 20 years' time. But if the management and the policy and everything around it looks good, you are prepared to put your money in. And maybe down the line you get the money. Now, I'm not convinced that the talk of privatization in South Africa is talking to the private investors' need to make a return at some point. Now, you might have a mining company which needs to get its iron ore to the coast. And it might be prepared to actually build the railway line to get its goods to the coast, in which case it would invest. But in most cases, I think the private investor is saying, am I guaranteed a return somewhere? In which case you need to give me a policy environment that is favourable.
But in the UK, of course, we've had a privatization which involved a split between the infrastructure and operations, which is now actually being reversed. Do you think that's something that the South African government might go down that path and maybe make some of the mistakes that we have made?
I think they're going down a path which is strewn with disasters, and they are still continuing.
Like,
So, I mean, the infrastructure, they separated in Britain, and you know more about this than I do, but they separated the track and the infrastructure from the operation of the trains. This makes no sense. It doesn't take a university degree to see this doesn't make sense. Because if your job is to maintain the track and the infrastructure, how do you make your money apart from monthly payments? How do you make a profit as a business? You cut costs. And when you cut costs, you start compromising on safety. If the two are integrated, which they always were on the South African railways and British rail, is you say, we're running trains. Part of our job is to make sure the trains are safe. Therefore, we make sure the track is safe. Maintenance, constant maintenance. My father used to talk, he was an electrician on the South African railways. Every so often he would report. They had these logbooks where they had to report what they were doing. And he would say, foot patrol between this station and this station. And he would walk 8 miles of track to check on the overhead equipment. Now, you don't do that. You don't have people doing that and paying them to do it when your job is to cut costs. But if you're part of the big organization, you do it.
but the problem there is if you try to get this new private operator, and he wouldn't own the track, so he would be a kind of separate kind of company.
So what you want him to do
yeah,
is say, you take over the line from Johannesburg to Kimberley,
right.
and you run it. You
Right.
market it, you sell the, to passengers and goods or whatever. You do it.
Oh, you sell an integrated railway.
Integrated railway.
Right.
And
Right.
and the where they've got it wrong is they splitting up parts of the operation into different companies instead of saying this is an integrated operation. Now you run it
Right.
at a profit, and maybe you have to pay a fee to the government.
Okay, so just to end, I mean, have you any optimism that maybe if I come back in 5 years' time, I might be able to take a train from Cape Town to Kimberley and up to Pretoria?
Well, I have to say that I'm a glass half empty on this one.
Right.
The glass is half full,
Right.
but I'm tending towards the empty because what gives one reason for optimism is that it's possible, it can be done, and there is an institutional legacy, even though a lot of skills have been lost. The basis is there, the foundation is there for a good railway, infrastructure and so on. Lots of things have to be fixed. I worry not so much about whether it's physically possible. Financially possible, if you can get private investment, there's not enough government investment. There has to be the will. There has to be someone or a group of people who comes in and says, I have a vision for this, and this is how we're going to do it, and drive it, make it happen. And I don't see that person or people at the moment.
Yes, I'm afraid that your most famous at the moment South African, a certain Mr. Musk, doesn't have much interest in railways. Otherwise, he'd have the money to do it. But David, thank you so much for that. Just to finish off, remind me of the title of your book.
It's called On the Railway, which is a double meaning or triple meaning kind of title. It's about the railways. It's also working on the railway, the people who worked on the railway, and on the railway in the sense of a reflection on how railways work. It's a cross between memoir of my own as a railway child, but also the history of railways in South Africa. And I call it the Great South African Train Story. On the Railway, the Great South African Train Story.
And it's a jolly good read. And thank you for coming on Calling All Stations. Thank you, David.
I think many listeners, Christian, will be really surprised to hear about the state of railways in South Africa, because it looks like the kind of country which is a natural for a successful railway network.
That's absolutely true. And it was the 10th largest network in the world. It had some wonderful trains, as David actually writes about in his book. I mean, really famous kind of trains running across the country. And yes, the distances are quite big in some cases. 300-400 miles between major towns, as I mentioned only about 1,000 miles between Johannesburg and the Cape, but it's a long drive. It's very hard by bus, so you'd think that they'd managed to maintain a rail service on some parts of that network at least. Of course, it would probably require some subsidy, but on the other hand, so do the roads. But really, it's a sad state of affairs. And that did slightly continue as I went on my journey further north.
So tell us about the next steps.
Well, after we reached Johannesburg, which was a bit of a diversion from the route I was following, which is the Cape to Cairo Railway, which was, of course, Cecil Rhodes, the great mining magnate and businessman who actually conceived of the idea of running a Cape to Cairo railway. In other words, a railway that ran through the whole of Africa, and he wanted it to be in what was then British colonial territory all the way up. And it was an ambition that he had, but never quite achieved. He died in 1902 at the age of just 48. But quite chunks of it were built. So the whole idea of the book was to try to find what had happened to those sections that had been built and so on. So we followed the route of the railway. Johannesburg was slightly out of the way, where we just went to do a couple of interviews, but we then went back onto the route at a place called Mafeking and continued northwards. And sadly, the railway, both at a place called Vryburg and at Mafeking, the stations had completely disappeared. In fact, there was a rather funny incident at Vryburg, which had once been a thriving railway town, where we couldn't find the station. It wasn't on Google Maps. And then I saw a bloke kind of who was sort of just about getting his van. And we said, do you know where the station is? And he said, the station? Why do you want to go there? It's Vecht. It's in best kind of Afrikaner English. And it was hilarious. And we went along to the station. He led us in his ute, his utility vehicle, to the station, and it was a sort of brick station where the roof had fallen in. The platform was just a mass of weeds and grass, and the sign that said Vryburg, Cape Town, 1,500 kilometers away or whatever. And there was absolutely nothing left of this station at all. It had been long abandoned. And long before COVID, whereas the other stations that we visited on the way up from Cape Town had actually been abandoned at the time of COVID, so that they weren't in that bad a situation. But the one in Vryburg and in Mafeking, they'd completely disappeared. There was nothing left of it. Anyway, so we continued on our way, but that was a kind of hilarious encounter with this guy, which will end up in the book. I mean, in fact, I wondered about when I should call the book. Why do you want to go to the station? It's Fucked. It was be quite a good title for the book.
I mean, again, I was just to labour the point, but it all to me seems completely counterintuitive for a country. South Africa's part of the BRICS, nations that were the kind of up and coming nations of the 21st century, and it just seems to me incomprehensible that they can fulfill their potential as a nation without an effective railway system.
Absolutely. There are still a few freight trains running on it, but few and far between. And I was told that, for example, the coal output is not as big as it could be because they can't get the coal to the ports, and the same applies to other minerals. And because the lack of trains, then the roads become actually much, much worse, because all these huge trucks carrying 40 tons of mineral, which would be much better in trains, are then kind of wrecking the road. So it's kind of completely counterproductive. But it's down to, as David Williams said, a mixture of corruption, of bad management, of the effects of COVID, and the failure to recognize the importance of the railways. I mean, all these things, and it's just such a tragic situation. So we tried our luck in Botswana, which is the next bit of the Rhodes Cape to Cairo line. It went from the capital Gaborone. It went from Mafeking into Botswana, into the capital Gaborone, which is the south of Botswana, and up through to Francistown, which is in the north along the Kalahari Desert. A section of that incident was built at the rate of a mile a day in 1897. It was kind of extraordinary constitution by these, amazing, by these brothers Pauling. They had to go back and kind of improve it a bit, but essentially they did a mile a day all the way through to Bulawayo, which is in Zimbabwe. So we followed the railway up to Francistown. We were in a hire car at the time. Francistown is a small town in the north of Botswana. And then we had to abandon the hire car because they wouldn't let us drive it in Zimbabwe. And we then took a bus overnight to Bulawayo. There had been trains in Botswana which ran to Bulawayo from Gaborone until COVID. These trains were no longer running. And we kind of stopped at a couple of places in Botswana and tried to find out why. And nobody really could give us a decent explanation, except, they'd stopped during COVID. And both Francistown and Gaborone had lovely refurbished stations with waiting rooms and God knows what else, kind of in very good condition, that were not in use. And there were security staff, so they weren't being kind of trashed, but it was really a waste. And one guy we bumped into said, "Oh yeah, I used to take the train regularly from Francistown to Bulawayo to visit my relatives, and now I can't anymore, and I have to take the bus, which is a hassle," and so on. So very sad. So we get to Bulawayo, which is in the south of Zimbabwe, and the line built by Rhodes, or rather the Pauling brothers, continued then up to Victoria Falls, which is about 400 miles north of Bulawayo. And there, at last, we found a train that still runs, and it runs once a week on a Friday. And we, for complicated reasons, we got on the train midway through because we were invited to go to a safari park for a couple of days. We had to wait for the train. We had to wait for Friday. And we took this ramshackle train. We got on it off the ballast at a place called Ngamo, which was kind of about a third of the way up from Bulawayo to Victoria Falls. And it was a very slow train. It arrived, it was supposed to arrive at Ngamo at 3:00 in the morning, which was not the most convenient time. And we were waiting on the ballast for ages. And actually, it didn't come till 7:00. So it was 4 hours late. And it was about 150, 200 miles to Victoria Falls. And we got on it at 7:00 in the morning. So it was much later than originally. It was by then about 4 or 5 hours late. And we eventually got to Victoria Falls, which is only a couple of 100 miles away, as I say, by 7:00 in the evening. So it took 12 hours to do 200 miles. And it stops everywhere, and it had to wait for the odd freight train. And it just, there was no explanation. It rattled along, at a terrible pace. But the good news was that there was a train, because it had been reinstated post-COVID by Zimbabwean Railways. And the sad thing is, Mark, that, we took these trains, and there was another one, which I'll tell you about in a minute. They're incredibly well used. They're really necessary for the local people, because the road between Bulawayo and Victoria Falls is appalling, because we had to drive along some of it, and with huge potholes and whatever. So these railways provide an absolute vital link for people, and kind of allowing them to fall into disrepair or not run at all is such a disastrous policy and so bad for local people. And when they are operating, and they create a whole lot of jobs, because you then get hawkers selling food to people on the train, and you get people being able to take their agricultural produce to the nearest big town and so on. I mean, they're absolute vital links, given the bad roads and so on. Anyway, so we got to Bulawayo. We got to Victoria Falls eventually. Big tourist place, of course. And again, a lot of potential for the railway to run properly rather than kind of half-heartedly as it does. because Victoria Falls, inevitably is a real tourist honeypot with quite a lot of reasonable hotels and quite posh restaurants and the like. So again, a great shame that it's not kind of serviced by a proper railway. And then we walked over the frontier. The frontier to Zambia is over the bridge built by roads between the two countries across the Zambezi River, about half a mile south of the falls. Unfortunately, we couldn't really see the falls because there's so much water coming out that there's so much steam or whatever coming out of it that you couldn't actually see the falls. It's the busiest time. The sort of end of the rainy season is the busiest time, so you couldn't actually see the falls. So we walked across into Zambia, and there is on the Zambian side there's a town called Livingston, named after one famous doctor, and there is a train once a week to the place we're headed to, which is called Kapiri and Pocha, which was about 600 miles away in northern Zambia. But it didn't time with our other train. We couldn't take the train. We had heard it still runs, so it would be possible actually to get a train all the way from Bulawayo to Dar es Salaam, which is to get a series of 3 different trains from there. So that part of the trip could actually be done all by railway. Anyway, we took 2 buses instead, 2 days in buses, one of which was incredibly cramped and very uncomfortable, and I barely couldn't move my knees at all. And the other one was quite a comfortable bus ride from the capital, Lusaka, which is traffic-ridden and insanely kind of congested, and one of those towns where cars have been allowed to kind of run riot and there's no public transport, so people have no alternative and so on. Anyway, so we get to this place called Kapiri and Pocha, which is the southern end of a railway built by the Chinese, which runs all the way up over 1,500 miles up to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And that's a 3-day ride, and it runs once a week, every Tuesday at 2:00 in the afternoon. It leaves, and it arrives sometime on Friday, 3 nights later. And we managed to get that train, and again, it was better maintained than the Bulawayo Victoria Falls line. It was like a proper railway, and there's quite a lot of freight, and it's only, as it were, 50 years old, but the coaches were probably 50 years old as well. And it wasn't entirely comfortable, particularly some of the bumps in the middle of the night literally threw you up in the air. I mean, literally. I was actually, at some of the times, it was trying to catch up time and going about 60, 70 miles an hour. And I seriously kind of worried about derailments. But we got to Dar es Salaam again about 6 or 7 hours late. But we got there after this 3-day journey.
I think that's absolutely amazing. And hopefully our listeners enjoyed that description as much as I did. So you got to Dar es Salaam, and that was the end of the first stage of this odyssey.
Yes.
And then you're going back to Africa.
Yeah.
To complete.
We're going to go back to Dar es Salaam, and there's a railway through to Lake Tanganyika. That is partly a new railway built by the Chinese, partly an old one. And then somehow make our way north into Kenya. I mean, hopefully, maybe by boat, but apparently there aren't many boats. There's apparently an old German First World War steamer that runs along Lake Tanganyika, which would be an experience in itself. And then get to Nairobi, and then take the train to Mombasa, back to the Indian Ocean. And then, unfortunately, we'd like to go through Sudan, but that's not going to be possible. So we're going to fly to Cairo and then take the railway down to a place called Wadi Haifa, which is just over the Sudanese border, a railway built by the British kind of in the 19th century. And it did actually continue to Khartoum. I don't know whether it still does, but a railway essentially built to reconquer Sudan after the fall of Gordon and the massacre in 1884. About 10 years later, the British built a military railway, which I describe in Engines of War, through to Khartoum. But I don't think that Sudan is safe enough to travel in. I mean, we did have a couple of incidents in Africa. One of the incidents was quite strange at the border on the train, the Tazara train between Kapiri, Impocha, and Dar es Salaam. At the frontier, we got out of Zambia okay, but then when we got to the other side by train, they took a mile through no man's land. We then kind of encountered the immigration officers, and by then it was 9 o'clock at night. And we were taken to some little shed, and they said, "We can't stamp your passport because we don't have the means to charge you here. The $50 you have to pay." And we said, "Oh, we've got credit cards." And no, we haven't got the means. We have to get in our car. And they got us in an old ambulance. Where I was sitting on the bed and I had to bend my head because, otherwise it would bump. And we went up the worst road we've ever went up. And there's kind of 4 of us Europeans who are being asked to pay the visa fee because all the Zambians and the Tanzanians obviously didn't have to pay this fee. And we did think for a moment, is this, why are these people taking us up this road? And they said, "Oh, it's just up the road." But actually it was about 2 kilometers away. But eventually they took us to the road border post. And then we had a hassle because they couldn't take my credit card because the credit card machine didn't work. And they wanted dollars, and I didn't have any dollars. I had pounds. And eventually one of the other guys had spare dollars, and I gave him some pounds for his spare dollars. And we paid it, and we didn't get a receipt and so on. And then oddly enough, the immigration officer drove us back to the station and said, "Oh, I'm very sorry about all this. We're very embarrassed about all this, that we have to drive you up here. But, our machine down the bottom isn't working." And I mean, it was all very kind of bizarre. And we thought, are we being kidnapped here or hijacked, or are they going to rob us? But we kind of realized it was okay when they took us to this huge border post. And there was probably about 50 truck drivers waiting to be processed, but we jumped ahead of the queue and got dealt with. But that's the sort of thing you get in Africa. They're kind of weird, kind of inexplicable events the whole time, but it makes for a lot of fun.
So the book is coming out next year, is the plan, and it's going to be called In Search of Africa's Lost Railway. So we'll look forward to hearing about the second stage of the trip and the run-up to the publication of the book. Of course, you've got a book coming out shortly, Christian, haven't you, on another subject?
That's right. At the end of July the 23rd, my book about high-speed railways is going to come out. I think we'll probably devote an episode to it, although we've talked about it before, but there's quite a lot in the book that we haven't talked about. Most of it is fantastic news about really how high-speed railways have kind of really reinvigorated railway systems across the world, whether it's in South Korea or Turkey or the most famous places, Japan and China, or France and Spain and so on. Lots of interesting things to write about. And of course, there was a chapter on the 2 nations that have been most troubled in trying to build high-speed lines, which is ourselves and the United States, the 2, United Kingdom and United States, where the lack of unity, in fact, over these projects has meant terrible troubles. And, we could talk about those as well. But anyway, the book will be coming out. We'll talk about it a bit more in a future episode. And even though I say so myself, it's got the best cover of any book I've ever written. It's got a really exciting cover. And we'll feature that at some point as well. So, yes, an exciting time coming up.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, I think this might be a slight repeat, but having just travelled halfway across the world and back again by aeroplane on these huge, big 787 Boeings, twin aisles, kind of, carrying 300 or something people. I'm struck by the madness of the idea that they still carry life jackets for everybody, and they actually have to get the poor air crew kind of in front of you, putting on one of these life jackets and showing you how to blow extra air into it, and that you have to blow a whistle, and you have a little torch and stuff. And of course, they're carrying 300 of these things underneath your seats. And the notion that this is ever likely to come into use, particularly, you're flying from Cape Town through to London, and you're only going over the sea for the Mediterranean for a little bit of that. And the notion that these planes that fly at 500 miles an hour are going to softly land on a bit of water and allow you to jump out into, put your life jacket and jump. It's complete and utter madness. And it was a serious point here, and that, there's a huge cost in carrying all this stuff about and ridiculous instructions at every flight. But also, you think that maybe they're not sufficiently kind of concentrating on other aspects, notably fires, which are by far a more likely event than crashing in the sea at a speed slow enough to which you'll be able to kind of get the doors open and jump off with a life jacket and fitting it and not pulling the string until you're out of it, because otherwise you wouldn't get through the door. I mean, it's stuff and nonsense. It's really high time that the international air authorities kind of recognized that and, stopped the requirement to carrying this stuff. I mean, it's more, Imperial Airways than kind of British Airways, as it were. And it's time to call a day on life jackets on planes.
Thank you for listening to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Warmar, which is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please do consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media. You can find Cogitamus Limited, Calling All Stations podcast, Christian Warmar and Mark Walker across a variety of platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky and X.